Yesterday, I got home from Egypt, and one of the things I found myself discussing over the last month that I was there is one of the major conundrums of the Great Pyramid. I haven't yet been able to wrap my mind around why exactly the 4th Dynasty pyramids seem to break so many of the traditions established by earlier dynasties. If we look at 3rd Dynasty tombs in particular, we can see that this tradition of decorating and painting tombs was already well underway leading into the 4th Dynasty. The interior corridors of the tombs of Hesi, Ra, and Djoser are all decorated with reliefs and or paintings of the royals striding forward in the Hebsed festival or smiting their enemies while wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. Furthermore, 3rd Dynasty tombs followed the tradition that had been established since the beginning of time, in which the deceased are placed below ground in sandpit burials or rock-cut tombs. And even when pyramids do begin to emerge, the pyramid itself is constructed out of only modestly sized limestone blocks, something that somebody like I could carry myself. And these pyramids are erected above a shaft that's dug either vertically or at a 45-degree angle into the ground. However, when we arrive in the 4th Dynasty under the reign of the Pharaoh Senefru, all of these cultural norms either halt altogether or are significantly diverted. And this is one of the places where understanding the cultural context of ancient Egypt is crucial to seeing some of the contradictions within modern-day Egyptology. Now, I should pause there. This is not me saying that Egyptologists are intentionally contradicting their own narrative, but rather the ancient Egyptians were not simple people that we are able to easily place in these neatly defined boxes. They were a very complex culture, and it is our disconnection from them and insufficiencies in our understanding of them that prevent us from being able to have a non-contradictory view of the ancient Egyptians. For instance, we view the Egyptians as the world's most conservative culture. They didn't change. Change was a bad thing. The divine order of life, the artistic style, and kingship of Egypt was all established at the beginning of time. And any time that divine order was disrupted, bad things happened in Egypt. So in one sense, Egyptologists have their view that if the Egyptians had their way, nothing would ever change. But in another instance, we have to acknowledge the deliberate change and evolution of certain core Egyptian practices. And in terms of 4th Dynasty burials, I find it puzzling that only the initial handful of pyramids built during the 4th Dynasty break these established traditions. For instance, while the subterranean corridors of Djoser's Step Pyramid built during the 3rd Dynasty are decorated with turquoise accents meant to resemble Djoser's ancient apartment in Memphis, along with the doorway reliefs that show him performing the Hebsed festival, we find absolutely nothing similar to this within the interiors of the 4th Dynasty Meidum Pyramid, Bent Pyramid, Red Pyramid, Khufu's Pyramid, Khafra's Pyramid, Menkaura's Pyramid, or Userkaf's Pyramid. And the vast majority of these pyramids, the interiors are lined with these perfectly finely cut limestone blocks, which would have been perfect for incised reliefs, which are actually commonly found among many other 4th Dynasty tombs of people who have much less importance than the pharaoh himself. It's not that the 4th Dynasty rids itself of interior tomb decoration as a whole, I guess, other than the recessed paneling that you can see inside Menkaura's pyramid, but it's as if they are deliberately not decorating the interior of the original 6 pyramids of the 4th Dynasty. And of course, these are ancient Egypt's most famous and monumental pyramids. Furthermore, the bedrock shaft tombs are largely done away with. While the initial descending passages may breach the bedrock, many of the passages then ascend back into the pyramid structure above the bedrock. And sometimes, like the Great Pyramid, they have chambers both above and below the bedrock. This has led many Egyptologists to conclude that the 4th Dynasty pyramids, and the Great Pyramid in particular, may have been continual experiments where the architects changed their design at multiple stages. For instance, Egyptologists like Ludwig Borchardt may propose that the subterranean chamber dug beneath the Great Pyramid was originally intended to be the burial chamber for Khufu. However, at a certain point, it was decided by the architects that the middle chamber, which we now refer to as the Queen's Chamber, was later on intended to be the burial chamber. And then shortly afterwards, Khufu's burial chamber was finally decided to be what we now refer to as the King's Chamber. However, this idea that the Great Pyramid's architects just haphazardly designed the pyramid on the spot does no justice at all to the overall project that is executed to such a high degree that there is no evidence for the construction process having ever been altered. All of the evidence points toward the fact that the entire interior of the Great Pyramid was planned from the very beginning and it was executed as designed. Now, here's the problem I have with this. Most scholars agree that the Great Pyramid, along with all of the other 4th Dynasty pyramids, were completely finished. The portcullises were closed and the kings were laid to rest within the pyramids. But with the complete lack of anything resembling a tomb being carried over in tradition from the 3rd Dynasty into the 4th Dynasty, I have a hard time not acknowledging some kind of break at the beginning of the 4th Dynasty. The complete lack of any interior decoration at all within the pyramids, as well as the pyramid burial chambers moving from below ground to now above ground, to me suggests some kind of major psychological shift here at the very least. If these are indeed above ground burial chambers, what could have caused the pharaoh to choose to intern himself above ground, turning the back on tradition of hundreds of years before him? Is he, in a sense, elevating himself above all previous pharaohs? Is he now viewing himself as one with Ra, the patron deity of the 4th Dynasty? Is he now something more than just man? Once I started researching this idea that the 4th Dynasty pharaohs must have been taking major detours from the previously established traditions, I found that Egyptologists Rainer Stadelman and Mark Lehner also proposed the idea that these pharaohs are now viewing themselves as the physical incarnations of the sun god, resulting in some kind of lost cosmic or religious reasons for laying the king high above ground. Perhaps they viewed the pyramid as a cosmological vessel for merging the king with Ra in the afterlife. And as you can see, when you get to the point of getting down to speculating the purpose as to the design of the pyramids, our view and ability to perceive what is going on in the heads of the architects of the pyramids becomes very hazy as we try to swim through this primordial soup of ancient history. We are so far disconnected from the Old Kingdom that, in a sense, they are a lost civilization or kingdom in which we take scant bits of evidence to try to reconstruct their worldview, as well as what kind of lost knowledge, technology, and techniques that they would have been using. But I have another idea. I find the contextual evidence of the Great Pyramid to be so puzzling that I've begun to wonder, and not in any kind of pseudoscientific or woo-woo way at all, I've begun to wonder if perhaps Khufu's body was never intended to be laid in the Great Pyramid. Sometimes in studying ancient cultures, you can look at the behavior and decisions made by younger generations to interpret the behavior and decisions made by the generations prior. What I mean by this is during the Middle Kingdom, we see a resurgence in the construction of pyramids as funerary monuments for divine kings. Namely, Amenemhat I erects a large pyramid complex harkening back to the pharaohs of the Golden Age during the Old Kingdom. Unfortunately, because the techniques and maybe even the technology used to construct the old pyramids have been lost during the time of the collapse of the Old Kingdom, Amenemhat's pyramid was built of noticeably smaller stones and rapidly fell apart during antiquity. Furthermore, during excavations of his complex in the early 1900s, archaeologists discovered that the larger stones used in his complex were actually raised from various even more ancient temples bearing the names of Khufu, Khafra, Userkaf, and Unas, all powerful pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. So we can see here a calling back to the ways of the Old Kingdom from pharaohs in the Middle Kingdom. And in here, we may be able to view things that are taking place in the Middle Kingdom that are actually inspired by traditions that were established in the Old Kingdom, but to us 5,000 years later are otherwise undetectable, or are at least undiscovered thus far. So what this is all getting to is there may be some evidence that Amenemhat I actually had two burials, one possibly symbolic and the other physical. His reign is the first time we see glimpses of evidence of two burial sites for a pharaoh, even though this concept may be inspired by a practice active in the Old Kingdom. Furthermore, just 5 pharaohs later, we actually have definitive evidence of this practice existing within the reign of Senwosret III. Senwosret III may actually be ancient Egypt's most overlooked pharaoh. He ruled during the Middle Kingdom, so he was too late for the height of pyramid building in the Old Kingdom, and he was too early for the height of Egyptian empire, which would come come out of the new kingdom. However, he is the pharaoh who brought the Middle Kingdom to its height of prosperity. He crushed the regional rulers who competed against previous pharaoh's throne, and it was under him that craftswork, trade, and urban development absolutely exploded. This is one of the most overlooked times of prosperity in ancient Egypt. In fact, life in Egypt was so good that Senwosret is actually one of the only kings to ever be deified and honored with a religious cult during his lifetime. And it's because of this prosperity that we get a somewhat more clear view into his world, as well as his very well-built and preserved monuments. And it's the basis for why I claim that the early 4th Dynasty pyramids may have never actually been physical tombs. Senwosret III had 2 monuments built for his death. One was a pyramid and surrounding complex erected at Dashur, and the other was a rock-cut tomb at the sacred site of Abydos. The rock-cut tomb was an elaborate series of corridors complete with a solid granite sarcophagus that seems to have been displaced from deeper within the tomb sometime in later antiquity, probably when the tomb was being looted thousands of years later. These 2 burial sites raise many interesting questions, and after examining the images available of the interior of the Senwosret pyramid at Dashur, I feel that it may be a symbolic burial place for the king known as a cenotaph. And Senwosret's actual burial site may have been within his rock-cut tomb down at Abydos, placing him near the burial place of the god Osiris, as well as the older kings of the early dynastic period. And in fact, this is exactly what Jacques de Morgan, the first excavator of Senwosret's pyramid, thought in the 1890s. He felt that the pyramid never actually contained the remains of the pharaoh, but rather it was a symbolic burial place, and the real burial site was down at Abydos alongside the kings of the early dynastic period, before the burial sites of the kings moved northward to the pyramids of Saqqara, Dashur, and Giza under the pharaoh Djoser. But that's just the thing. What if the burial sites for pharaohs of ancient Egypt never did move north? What if the 4th Dynasty pharaohs Senefru, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaura were never actually buried in their pyramids? What if they were actually buried in secret caches down at Abydos to be near the earlier kings as well as the god Osiris? But if the kings aren't actually being buried in the pyramids, what's the point of building them, and why do they have sarcophagi in them? Well, the Egyptians didn't view themselves the way we view ourselves today. They saw themselves as an amalgamation of different aspects, but most importantly, the Ba and the Ka. The Ba made up the person's physical body and personality, but the Ka was their vital essence, their life force, their soul and spirit that lived on forever. And this vital essence needed to be nourished to survive in the next world, meaning that offerings needed to be placed to feed the soul in the afterlife, which is why we find offering tables lying at the foot of doorways to nowhere at almost every tomb around Egypt. And as time goes on, I begin to wonder, if these 4th Dynasty pharaohs really are seeing themselves as the physical embodiment of the sun god Ra, how does this affect their perception of their own Ka, their spirit and their vital essence? Does the Ka become Ra? Does the Ka now need its own burial place to receive offerings? And because this Ka is now more than a mere man, it's linked to the sun god, is it not buried below ground like the kings of old were? And perhaps that is why the burial chambers now ascend above the bedrock within the 4th Dynasty pyramids. Could this also be why there are no reliefs or hieroglyphs within any of the 4th Dynasty pyramids? Perhaps the Ka at this time didn't need anything written into the walls because whatever might have been written is already intrinsically implied. And I've also seen some Egyptologists try to suggest that, well, perhaps sacred hieroglyphics were not a practice at pyramid complexes prior to the late 4th Dynasty, but that's just not the case. A few months ago, I visited the Bent Pyramid's Valley Temple, which very, very few people have ever been to, where the faces of the limestone blocks have been cut off and removed and are now on display at the Grand Egyptian Museum. These reliefs are offering scenes where people are bringing the king Senefru, who is attributed as the builder of the Bent Pyramid, gifts and food. These are either depicting the king during his life, or perhaps the scene is intended for his Ka in the afterlife. We just don't know because the section depicting Senefru unfortunately didn't survive antiquity. But the point here is hieroglyphs are being used in pyramid complexes at the very beginning of the 4th Dynasty, making this argument irrelevant. However, it raises so many questions in my mind. Why are we seeing hieroglyphs and reliefs on the exterior temples around the pyramid complex at the beginning of the 4th Dynasty, but still not in the interior of the bent pyramid. I've also seen it proposed that these pyramids perhaps were just never completed, and that's why we don't see hieroglyphs in the interior. Maybe this would be a passable explanation for one pyramid, but 7 pyramids consecutively, I don't buy it. There must be a deliberate reason to purposely not adorn the interiors of the pyramids with any writing or depictions of anything whatsoever. What I'm getting at here is maybe Khufu's body was never actually buried in the Great Pyramid. And I wonder if he, along with the other early 4th Dynasty pharaohs, aren't still buried somewhere in a secret cache down at Abydos so that they could be buried alongside the other kings of the early dynasties. After all, Abydos is the primordial burial place of the god Osiris, as well as most of the kings that came before Senefru. Either way you cut it, the early 4th Dynasty pyramids don't make a lot of sense, and they puzzled people for nearly 5,000 years. When you're trying to understand the psychology of the pyramid builders, they are perplexing architecturally, culturally, and spiritually. Their near perfect alignment to the cardinal directions, their immensity, which certainly indicates that they are meant to serve as monuments as much as, or perhaps more than, a burial, the multiple chambers and varied designs of each pyramid, as well as the complete lack of inscriptions, makes these monuments some of, or maybe the most compelling monuments on the planet. And the more I think about it, the more that I feel that perhaps the Great Pyramids were never actually intended to have their pharaohs buried within them. And Khufu's body might actually just be resting somewhere down at Abydos along with the remains of the 500 years of kings that came before him. And that the pyramids may actually have some other undetectable spiritual, psychological purpose that we are so disconnected from today. Or maybe the new chamber discovered by the Scanned Pyramids project sitting above the Grand Gallery is actually connected to the actual King's Chamber, which still holds Khufu's remains and all of his treasures today. But I'll save that for another video. I'm Luke Caverns. If you'd like more videos diving into the world of ancient Egypt, well, please like and subscribe for more, as that's really all you have to do to help out the channel.